This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome back to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'll be your host today, and I'm joined by the ever-present Dr. Richard Blackaby.
The indubitable Dr. Richard Blackaby. Yeah,
that's a pet word of yours, Richard. I think that's
good to be with you, Sam.
Up before, yeah. Well, we're tucking in here in between big trips and various events that you've got going on. You've got a busy spring.
Boy, I know.
And always
maybe
always
my
on the run.
Or one of the busiest.
Yeah, you've been mentioning that, and so we're trying to load up as many of these as we can. We've got some great. We've had some great conversations already.
Yeah.
On the podcast. Most recently, Kevin Beers, and then followed by Rob, your cousin Rob.
Yeah,
and,
cousin Rob.
And these have just been really fascinating conversations. I've enjoyed listening to those, and we've got some more in the pipeline here, and just excited to get some of those out. But we don't want to neglect the Bible, obviously, and we don't want to neglect our little mini series we've been doing of undetermined lengths, disciple making, and we're diving into Luke chapter 9, and we're seeing the pattern that Jesus uses when he's training, equipping, preparing his disciples, and how we can apply that to our lives today.
Yeah, and we were looking at the fact that if you want to know how Jesus is going to walk with you, just look how he walked with his 12 disciples, and it's the same Jesus. He's has the same priorities, trying to bring out the same things in your life that he was trying to bring out in Peter's life. And so it's always interesting to see how he does that. And he doesn't just sit his disciples down in a classroom and lecture them and say, take good notes, we'll have a midterm, and just fill their heads with information. He lets them live. And in the course of life, the lessons that are learned become unforgettable. And so we've seen that with Jesus, discipleship means following Jesus. Get out of your boat and go with him wherever he leads you. And so he's been taking them a number of places. And when you get to Luke 9, beginning of verse 28, you get to a very famous encounter. It says about 8 days after this conversation. And, I think that does remind us that the Bible typically has a context to it. And you miss a lot if you don't know what the context is. And so Luke made it very clear that this whole discussion about Jesus dying and being resurrected and telling his disciples, if you want to, you can't follow me unless you deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me. And if you try to save your life, you'll lose it. And so he's had this very, very powerful discussion about what is expected of disciples. And then it says about 8 days after that. So that, in other words, that conversation, those things Jesus said were very powerful. And I suspect the disciples have been kind of mulling this over ever since. And it says that he took along Peter, John, and James. And we've said this before, but we don't know why he took those three disciples. And, sometimes I hear stuff that's kind of said that is it's just total speculation, but it's said almost as if it's fact. Like, oftentimes it says, well, Jesus' best friend was John. Well, the Bible doesn't say that. Mm-hmm. John himself, out of humility, doesn't name himself when he's writing the Gospel of John. He often just says, the one Jesus loved. Well, that he's not trying to say I was his best friend. He's
or his favorite. Or...
Right. He's trying to say I'm going to modestly try not to mention my own name in my writing. And so to say, Jesus had a best friend, well, you can't really take that from there. Now, there's a couple of times where he takes these three disciples, what we call inner circle, mm-hmm. and in one sense, it is a bit of an inner circle in that, there's a couple of times where he does take these three. But we don't know really what that means. Could it mean that Jesus just didn't want the whole crowd that day? Maybe it was going to be too distracting to have 12 men all falling asleep around him while he's being transfigured? Or, is he trying to set some of these guys up to be a bit more in the know than other disciples? we don't know all of that. Like when he raises Jairus's daughter that has died, he only takes the same 3 guys in with him. But we can probably assume that this girl's little bedroom is probably not very big. So could also just mean he needed some crowd control downstairs, and he couldn't fit 12 men plus parents and himself in a room around one little bed. So you have to always be careful. So it doesn't really tell us why he just took these 3. Andrew, that always gets left out of the brothers, is certainly a noble character that God's going to use. And so we don't really know why, but this is one of those cases where, and what we find out later in this chapter is that the other 9 are sent off to do mission work. So he's got some of them still out there ministering while he has this kind of divine rendezvous with his Father. So he takes these 3 and he goes up on the mountain to pray. And of course, a lot of stuff happens when Jesus prays. And sometimes you might say, well, what would it take for God to do more in my life? Well, maybe you need to take more time praying the way Jesus did. And so it says, as he's praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly 2 men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. And of course, this is one of those very, very unusual moments where 2 men, long dead, have come back and are talking to Jesus, and lots of questions about this. Most people assume that Moses represents the law, which Jesus is going to fulfill, and Elijah represents the prophets. Those 2 men really symbolize that. Elijah considered perhaps the greatest of the prophets, and Moses, of course, the great lawgiver. And so the prophets all pointed to Jesus, as did the law. And so they are there now maybe talking about, all right, the fulfillment of everything that the law was pointing to, the prophets were pointing to, is going to be fulfilled at the cross, which is looming before Jesus at this point. What's also interesting about these 3 guys is that all 3 of them have mountaintop experiences. Moses, Elijah both go on to Mount Sinai, and Moses, of course, gets the law. Elijah goes up there to have a meeting with God. He hears that still small voice when he's discouraged. Moses will climb a mountain right at the very end of his life and look out over the promised land but not go in. Elijah has a mountaintop experience on Mount Carmel with the prophets of Baal. And so now here they are in a mountain again. These 3 guys also have wilderness experiences. Moses herd sheep for his father-in-law. He guides the children of Israel for 40 years. Elijah flees into the wilderness after he preaches to Ahab that there's going to be no water. Jesus, of course, is tempted in the wilderness for 40 days. And all 3 have government leaders who want to kill him. And so they have a lot in common. And of course, I don't want to take too much time to get into this, but one of the questions, of course, that we all want to know is what happens to you when you die? Like, where have Moses and Elijah been? Where do they come back from? We know as Christians, our ultimate hope is in a resurrection from the dead. That is why we celebrate Easter. But until that resurrection, where do those people go? What are they doing when they're dead? And where does Moses and Elijah get summoned from? They must have been somewhere. And I've got theories about that we can maybe get into at some point. Maybe that'll be another Bible study. But very, very unusual encounter. And so here Jesus is meeting with his Father. And of course, as we've said before, this is the Father's plan. This isn't Jesus's plan. Jesus doesn't plan to go to the cross. It's his Father's plan of salvation. And ever since Adam and Eve's fall, the Father has had a plan on how to redeem his fallen creatures, and Jesus is submitting to that plan. And so here now Jesus is meeting with his Father, who has been guiding him and fulfilling his redemptive purposes. Here's Moses, who knows what the law demands, and seeing how it's going to be ultimately fulfilled. Elijah knows what the prophets have foretold, and knows how Jesus will fulfill every one of those prophecies. And so it's a huge, huge moment. You kind of wonder why it needs to happen. You have to perhaps assume that if Jesus is being encouraged at this point, that he needs to be encouraged, which I think is probably interesting for us as leaders. If Jesus the Father meets with his Son personally, but then also brings two people back from the dead to try to encourage his Son, that might tell you something of the magnitude of what Jesus is facing, and the fact that if he doesn't face his big moments on his own, I mean, when he's on the cross, even then he's going to have his mother and some women there at the foot of the cross. He doesn't do things alone, and solitary martyr. And so even here, he's receiving encouragement ahead of time. And of course, he's got three of his disciples with him as well, though we'll see in a moment that they're sleeping. And it's interesting, it says that his clothes and his face became dazzling white. And so something happened to Jesus. We call this the transfiguration. And I think what's happening here is that Jesus has always been fully God and fully human, but his divinity has been kind of covered over with human skin, and it's almost as if the glory of his Godhead, of his divinity, bursts forth in this brief sacred moment. It's as if his divinity can't be just completely veiled at this point, and you see that he's God. Now, I'll tell you what an amazing moment that would have been.
Yeah.
To be with Jesus when if you had any doubts, is this person also God? Is he the Messiah? Those doubts would have been dispelled if you'd seen his glory bursting forth. And of course, that's in one sense, that's kind of what it means when we give glory to God. It is, we recognize his divinity, that he is God. And sometimes even in our worship services and our daily living, we can kind of cover that up. And giving God glory means you sort of take the veil away from people and you give God all the glory. You recognize just how much of God he is. And so it says that his glory is shining forth. And then verse 32 says, Peter and those with him were in a deep sleep. And so some of the Gospels don't necessarily say that so clearly, but they're sleeping. And of course, you just have to think to yourself, how many prayer times have we missed what we could have encountered with Jesus because we were not alert? We might not have fallen asleep, but we're spiritually dull and sluggish, and you just sort of wonder sometimes if, of course, then Jesus will go in the garden a few days or weeks later and be praying so that there's sweating drops of blood coming from him. You talk about fervent praying, and again, his disciples are all sleeping. And so there's just something to be said for what is missed because we're not alert as we pray.
Yeah, sleep, the great enemy of prayer.
And so, and that maybe that's why in their day you didn't close your eyes. I think that is such a killer, isn't it? You're as busy as we are and sleep deprived often, to slow down and close your eyes. That's not a good recipe for alertness.
I've been in many early morning prayer meetings, and that can be a struggle.
Yeah, that's a good idea, but. And so it says, when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men who were standing with him. And of course, it doesn't tell us how they knew that it was Moses and Elijah. Maybe this is something that they talk with Jesus about later, or they figured out. I don't know if maybe you'd recognize them by just seeing them. They didn't have pictures of them that they could have looked at as children to recognize. Oh, that's Elijah. But they figured that out. And it says, as the two men were departing. And so again, we don't really know how they departed. Did they just disappear? Did they vanish into a cloud, or what? But it's clear that they're beginning to leave. And so Peter said to Jesus, Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us set up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah, not knowing what he was saying. And again, as we've seen throughout this chapter, we'll see some more coming up. Over and over again, the disciples are going to come up with a plan. They're going to think, okay, we're leaders. God has given us a brain. We need to use it. And so here we've got, can you imagine? We've always heard about Moses and Elijah. Here they actually are. So let's build little tabernacles, little tents here on this mountaintop, and make it kind of a retreat center, a place where people can come and maybe be taught by these great people from the past. Just imagine the following we would have to say, come and hear Moses and Elijah speak live, and just think what credibility that will give you, Jesus, to know that those are your kind of lead acts there before you get up. Like before Jesus speaks, we're going to have Moses just talk a little bit, reminiscing about his days on Mount Sinai. Yeah. And of course, Peter, this is classic Peter. He's talking without thinking. And a lot of times we do this theologically. We haven't really thought through our theology very well. We're just talking. We've got opinions, but we're not really stopping to think what is the implication here of what we're saying. And one thing that Peter is saying is he's treating Jesus just like Moses and Elijah on equal footing. You'll each have your own tabernacle, and of course the Father sort of just removes Moses and Elijah. It's like, as great as these two men are, they're nothing compared to the Son of God, and of course that's sort of a tendency of ours and God's people today. Is let's just build a nice little structure and we'll have a great little worship time here together. We'll just find a mountaintop somewhere and we'll have just a great time of music and sharing and preaching, and of course Jesus is being prepared to go to a cross. He's prepared to suffer, to lay his life down, and Peter doesn't have that on his radar. It's no, this would be great. We just stay up here on the mountain, and of course mountaintop experiences certainly have their place in the Christian life. But they're always a place of preparation, never a place of retirement. You don't just sort of move up on the mountaintop. You go there to be restored, to have a fresh encounter with God, maybe to escape your enemies temporarily. But then at a certain point, once you've had that encounter with God, you go back down the mountain and you get back to work.
If you've ever wondered how to ask the right questions to help move people onto God's agenda, then consider attending Blackaby Ministries' Spiritual Leadership Coaching Workshop, April 17th to the 19th at Johnson Ferry Baptist Church in Marietta, Georgia. Not only is there great teaching at this workshop, but you will also get to practice what you learn. Use code EARLYBIRD at checkout for a special discount. To find out more and to register, visit blackabycoaching.org/workshop. Links will be in the show notes.
And so Peter comes up with a plan, and what we're going to see is that Jesus very quickly corrects him once again. And we've seen this pattern throughout this chapter, where the disciples come up with a plan, Jesus rebukes them, then Jesus gives them a better plan. and so that's what's going to happen here again. He says, Master, it's good for us to be here. And, he's calling Jesus his master, his Lord, but then Peter's trying to take charge. It's like, well, if he is your master, maybe you should stop talking and listen to what your master is planning on doing. You just woke up. You slept through the first part. You don't even know what's going on here, but you still have a plan of action. This is a time for you to kind of get caught up. But it says, while he was saying this, a cloud appeared and overshadowed them. And that ought to have been had a certain amount of foreboding here.
Yeah.
As Peter's coming up with a plan here in the mountaintop, this cloud begins to descend upon them. And you sort of get the impression this is not just some fluffy little cloud.
It just happens.
A little mist that, there's a certain foreboding, and it seems that this cloud is gathering quite quickly, because Peter doesn't have to say a lot of words before he's surrounded by this cloud. It says, and they became afraid as they entered the cloud. And so I would love to have seen exactly what this cloud looked like, because it was, there were some frightening clouds. If you think it's got lightning or tornado somewhere within it, but it became clear that Peter's plans were being interrupted here in a hurry. And then a voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, the chosen one. Listen to him." And you could almost sense the impatience of God the Father just trying to make Peter stop talking, stop planning. And he said this, here's one of those places where it would have been really interesting to hear the tone of voice. It's like, "This is my son, the chosen one. You listen to him." Like Peter, why are you talking? You're in the presence of Moses, Elijah, the Son of God, and God the Father, and you're coming up with the plan. You're trying to set the agenda for all those people, and you were asleep during the first part of the meeting. How ludicrous for you to be coming up with a plan, but that unfortunately is pretty typical of a lot of Christian gatherings, where we're not even aware of most of what's happening, but we still want to come up with a plan. We want to be in charge.
And it's that type of leader, type of personality as well. The folks who are just doers. Let's get something done here. And the danger is that you're getting the wrong thing done. Right.
And of course, as we've seen with a lot of leaders, oftentimes the very thing that is our strength is also our weakness. Mm-hmm. And so it's great to be someone who can get a lot done. But sometimes we can jump to action before we really even know what should be done. There is a certain mentality that says, I'd rather just get anything done than sit around and do nothing.
Right.
But that's not always wise. Mm-hmm. So if you get the wrong thing done, that can set you back and not move you forward. And it says in verse 36, after the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And I think sometimes what happens, certainly what should happen in a prayer time, is that all the other voices, distractions are removed from your sight, and all you've got left is Jesus. And I think sometimes that's what prayer and even what worship is intended to do. It is to focus us on Jesus and to hear his voice and to follow his lead. And so now all of a sudden, Jesus, you with Peter, I wish I knew what all is going on in Peter's mind. It's almost like, is he kicking himself, saying, "There I go again. I was talking, and that plan didn't go anywhere." And
is the reality of the situation dawning on his face?
Yeah, and it's like we saw before with the feeding of the 5,000. The disciples come up with a plan, and it is to send everybody away. And instead, Jesus does one of the greatest miracles of his entire ministry. And here, Peter is saying, let's go around and collect a bunch of sticks and leaves and branches and make a little lean-to, and then we can have this little makeshift kind of retreat center here on the mountaintop, and maybe offer some summer conferences and weekend getaways for people. And meanwhile, Jesus is talking about how to die for the sins of all humanity.
And you also wonder too, because it seems like that's probably his religious upbringing too. It's like that's what Moses would do. That's what Abraham did. They would, at significant points, they would build altars, and so you wonder how much of that sort of religious memory is also sort of activated in Peter to say, he gets that this is important, mm-hmm. and the only thing he knows to do is say, well, at important things, our forefathers would just build altars. And
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That in each case, Jesus is looking to do something that's never really been done before, and we tend to just default to what we know.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you don't, but he's trying to do something you don't know, something you've never even thought of happening. And so that's always going to be a danger. When God wants to do something new, we immediately start scrambling around in our our memory banks to say, well, what do I know that's similar to this?
Mm-hmm.
What do I know that I'm comfortable with? And sometimes God would say, well, don't go there, because you're immediately going to downsize what I want to do into something that you're familiar with. And a lot of us are, you can be intimidated by a brand new thing that God does. And so, I've never done that before, never gone there, never had to think about that before. I feel inadequate. I feel like maybe I couldn't do that. So I'm going to change up what God is trying to do and downsize it to something that I can manage. And, we do that a lot in churches. It's like, well, we sense that God wants us to make disciples of all nations, but clearly we can't afford that. So let's, maybe we could, add $100 a month in our budget to support this food kitchen down, in downtown or something. And it's like, well, there's nothing wrong with supporting that ministry, but I had much bigger plans for you.
Yeah.
But you downsized it to something that you thought you could afford, that you knew how to manage that. And we've said before, I'm kind of at the place where I want my life to be a part of something that I can't explain, that I've never done before, that I have no point of reference to even understand what I should be doing. I'm just kind of just following God one day at a time and letting him unfold it before my very eyes. And so this is one of those kind of classic examples of God trying to do a fresh new work, and the disciples trying to get their hands on the wheel and trying to say, then we can do this, we can do that. And I've been a part of meetings like that where you started out sensing that God was trying to intervene and introduce something unlike anything that we'd done before, but very quickly people start pulling from all their past experiences. Mm-hmm. Or, well, I was in a church once that did something kind of similar. Maybe we could do that. And I read about where people did this, and before very long, we've got our fingerprints all over this God thing, and now it just looks like what lots of other people have done. Yeah. And God was trying to initiate a brand new work that no one had ever seen before. And so this is kind of a classic one of just saying, and by the way, when it says, you've got Jesus in your midst, like, why are you talking? Why are you not listening? And I can't tell you how many planning meetings I've been a part of with Christians where we did way more talking than listening, where we certainly opened in prayer, and we probably closed the meeting in prayer, but everything in between was us talking, not God talking. And we say we want to seek God on this matter, and then we do almost all the talking ourselves. And you would have to say, if we really want to know what God thinks, we need to be spending a lot more time listening than discussing and talking. But we're much like Peter. Our minds are racing. We all come to a meeting filled with ideas of what we think we'd like to see. And so we've said the prayer. Now let's like all the Peters start talking and come up with a plan. And we might be really excited about it. And I think there's probably some times where God's wanted to do the same thing and send this ominous cloud into the conference room. And so we suddenly realize, I think God wants to take the floor again. He wants the mic back so he can do the talking instead of letting us going on and on with all of our plans.
Well, I'm sure glad to have Peter, and he has really given us so many examples throughout the Gospels of how we can often just sort of misunderstand and kind of get out ahead of our skis. And so we'll leave it here for now.
There's more to come.
There is more to come. We'll pick it up in a future podcast. But as always, Richard, thanks for walking us through this great chapter of Luke.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.